looked at were examples of youth environmental action where young people played pretty substantial roles in decision making, sometimes identifying the project from the very get-go, or sometimes the educator identified the project, but then the young people really figured out how are we going to make this happen and made a lot of decisions along the way. That's not the only approach to integrating youth development and environmental education. There's certainly other ways that that could be done, but within environmental action, one of the key challenges that the educators talked about was around that shared decision making and sort of knowing like how much to let the young people lead and go in the direction they want to go. And so just balancing encouraging youth, knowing when to step in and kind of offer support and guidance, figuring out how a project might fit with curriculum goals or with other organizational goals. So the educators, they didn't describe this really in a negative way. I mean, they said that they just talked about having to be cognizant of that and sort of always reflecting on their practice and reflecting on how they were interacting with the young people and how to ensure that young people that they were challenged, but in a way that they could be successful, not setting them up for failure. So when one of the educators mentioned working with teens who originally had ideas for a project that was so huge and it would have been really difficult to carry it off in the summer time frame that they had available. How do we sort of scale that down and get them to think about, okay, what's realistic? What are the different pieces that can be done? And so I just wanted to mention that it's, I think, a really valuable way of working with youth and of simultaneously achieving tangible, positive environmental change, while also having great learning outcomes for young people. But it can take a while to get comfortable with that shared decision making and sort of figure out what's the right balance in terms of the adult role and the young people's role, and having really good two-way communication, valuing mutual learning, recognizing that everybody has something they can bring to that process, I think is really valuable. But I just wanted to emphasize that I think it's highly rewarding with really valuable outcomes, but it may not, it'd probably be frustrating at times and feel chaotic and feel like, oh my gosh, everything may be falling apart and what's going to happen next. And as educators, we're not always comfortable with some of that uncertainty and letting go of control. The educators I interviewed were working in a really diverse settings. Some of them were classroom teachers, usually in science classrooms. Some of them were working at youth organizations or community organizations. Some of them were working at nature centers or science centers. And so their aims varied somewhat depending on the particular setting that they were working in. Sometimes they were using environmental action as a way to enhance science learning. Sometimes it was a means of achieving positive youth development. Sometimes it was in a more kind of what we might think of as a more traditional, looking to influence environmental knowledge and attitudes and behavior. But often the educators talked about really aiming to achieve multiple outcomes that related to developing young people's capabilities as citizens and as agents of change within their communities. And so that kind of surprised me because I had selected examples where there really were positive, tangible environmental outcomes. For example, transforming vacant lots, City of Buffalo, into community garden spaces, or restoring an area to native prairie habitat.
Right.
So you could see actual physical change in the environment. The educators, while they saw that as valuable, they really saw the learning experience and the ways in which young people were engaged in decision making and planning and implementing and sort of having to evaluate how are things going, how do we adapt, how do we modify as we run into challenges and barriers. Like that opportunity for youth to really develop confidence and a sense of efficacy and so forth were some of the, I don't know if they were intended or unintended learning outcomes, but the learning was much richer than what I had anticipated going in as a researcher in advance, in terms of the types of outcomes that the educators described observing. So for instance, this was a group middle school students who produced a short documentary, about a 20-minute documentary on green building, and they did site visits to homes in around the city of Ithaca, and they interviewed the homeowners, and then they did the videotaping, they did the interviews, they did the editing, and they produced a film that was premiered for community members. And so those students spoke about learning about a whole range of different environmental topics: energy efficiency, renewable energy, recycled materials, natural materials, a lot of the different decisions that homeowners had made in order to create homes that were more sustainable. But they also spoke, of course, learning how to create and edit a video, but they spoke about things like realizing how much time it takes to see a project through from start to finish, and developing a stronger work ethic, and working collaboratively, problem solving, sort of in the moment, on the fly, adapting, flexibility. So a variety of ways in which that experience provided both the kind of knowledge and maybe skills-based learning that we intend, but all of these other facets that are really important for young people as they're developing the characteristics of their identity that can help them be effective citizens and agents of change in the future as well. And so I think that's one of the goals of environmental education, is to help develop citizens who can participate towards environmental protection. And whether the young people, choose to continue to be involved around environmental issues, or maybe there are other issues they're really passionate about and they choose to become engaged in those ways, I think having young people who both can participate in their communities now when they're 10, 12, 16, but also further have an experience that leads them to maybe want to continue to be engaged as throughout their lives, is really valuable in terms of democratic society, but also we need people who are knowledgeable and can engage with environmental issues throughout the lifespan. So I think it's just it's very rewarding. For one thing, it's rewarding as an educator to see learners grow personally in that way as well. One of the educators I interviewed mentioned it can also be really useful in terms of garnering support for one's programs, because this was an urban agriculture program, and they were doing food security, but they're also doing nutrition. They're growing food sustainably. They're, fighting obesity. They're working on youth employment skills. So there are so many different facets, because it was very holistic in that they're accomplishing a lot of outcomes simultaneously. And so they're able to, garner support in terms of funding, and also in terms of partnerships with other various organizations within their community. So I feel like if we look at environmental issues in a silo, and we don't look at the ways in which they intersect with other important social issues, we miss opportunities. And so this is one way in which we can, have really strong environmental education, but in an approach that is sort of situating that, integrating that with other valuable outcomes as well. One of the educators who worked with youth in New York City in a community gardening project, one of the plants that they grew were collard greens. But he kind of summed it up by saying, we're growing more than collards in the garden, because they're producing food and they were donating it to a local food pantry and kind of increasing food security in their neighborhood. But really they were developing young people's skills and confidence and sense of themselves as being able to make a difference in the world.